All right, guys. So today we're looking at 2.2 here. This is a section called the Federalists Take Control. You'll remember from 2.1 that there are new political parties now. We have the Federalists, the party of Alexander Hamilton, and someone else that we're going to talk about in this section, and the Democratic Republicans, the party of Thomas Jefferson. So let's look at how the Federalists do here in power. I'll remind you as well that Washington leaves the White House and basically says, like, don't form political parties, don't get involved in foreign affairs, see y'all later, and then just walks into the sunset. And so there's a new political regime that's going to come into power here, and that is the Federalist Party. A couple things to really highlight for you is the Federalists versus Democratic Republicans dynamic, and we did a lot of that already in the previous section. The XYZ affair, we're going to talk about with President John Adams. Spoiler alert, he's the next president. Alien and Sedition Acts is going to be another John Adams thing. We're going to look at that in class and how that affects people. Nullification, and then under nullification, the two things to notice there are the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and those are going to reinforce this concept of nullification that I'll get to here in a second. So we're going to skip our crash course video in this section. You guys will be watching that one to figure out how the election of 1796 goes down. But we have Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. It is John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. Adams narrowly wins, and because this really hasn't come up yet, the second place is going to become the vice president. So, weird dynamic, but that means Adams wins, he becomes the president. Jefferson loses, he becomes the vice president. Now, I think this is an idea that a lot of people hate thinking about, but the more and more I think of it, my opinion is this kind of a cool concept, right? So, like, in presidential elections today, when the candidate wins, the other candidate says, okay, my opponent fought a good fight and I concede the election, and good luck to my person I was running all these attack ads against. But in this system, the two people running for president would be forced to work together. So there's a lot of people that say, like, this would never work in the modern era. I tend to think it would kind of cool down people's tension, maybe, because if your person loses, they're at least in the White House still. They might not be running the country, but they're kind of like helping the person run the country. And so they can take credit for things as well. Keep in mind, the vice president, while not having a ton of power, is the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. And at the time of recording, the Democrats and Republicans have a 50-50 split in the Senate. So a vice president of a minority party, or the party that didn't get the White House, would actually have a powerful play in this current system. So the more I think of it, the more I think it's kind of a cool idea that maybe people write off pretty easily, because we tend to think that the two people running for president wouldn't get along. But both sides of the political spectrum would at least have somebody serving their interests in different capacities. So that's my take on it. Feel free to disagree with that. There is going to be a 12th Amendment, and that 12th Amendment does kind of close this issue. So the reason we don't have this anymore is largely because of the 12th Amendment. We're going to skip this question just because I really want to get to some of the juicy things with John Adams' presidency. Now, one big thing that happens here is something called the XYZ affair. And how this goes down is John Adams is kind of having his diplomats go over to France, go over to England, talk to these foreign countries. The American delegation to France runs into some people called X, Y, and Z. And when they run into them, those guys are basically saying, "Yeah, we'll let you meet with our leaders. You just have to give us a little payment up front." And so they're basically asking for the American delegates to bribe them to get them to meet with their leader. The American delegates write back to Adams and say, look, here's what went down. France is basically not respecting us. They're saying we have to pay them to talk with their president. And Adams is furious. And he comes up with a really cool quote where he says, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, which is a fancy way of saying, I will spend millions of dollars to build up a navy and an army to go to war with you, France, before I pay you money to talk to your president. So he's kind of talking a big game here. And we'll see that Adams' presidency is, hate to say it up front here, but not terribly big success. But anyway, this is Adams kind of really confronting the French over this issue. And this is a political cartoon that I love to look at because it's so descriptive. What you have here is the American delegates, and then what you have here is your French guys who are bribing the American delegates. Worth pointing out that over here is Robespierre. He's the leader of the French government at this time. Now, he's not going to last very long, and he's also going to be beheaded, so that's fun. And then you can see in the background here, there is actually a guillotine beheading someone. And so the political cartoon is trying to make out that the American delegates here on the left are actually pretty civilized, and the French are being kind of ridiculous. And yeah, there's a little bit of anti-French propaganda popping up here. Okay, next big thing here. This is Adams kind of getting a little bit of a power trip. Now, you might remember John Adams we talked about in the Boston Massacre assignment and how he was the lawyer who represented the British soldiers. But John Adams as president is going to be kind of a little bit of a mixed bag as far as morality goes. So what he does here in these two acts, now they're kind of always lumped together, but the Alien and Sedition Acts are going to really try and hurt the Democratic Republican Party. Okay, the Alien Act, what it did was it made it harder for immigrants to become citizens to then vote in presidential elections. The reason why Adams is going after immigrants is because what he's figured out is the more immigrants that are coming to the United States, the more likely they are to vote for Democratic Republicans. So he's basically trying to say that immigrants need to wait longer to vote, so that he's trying to help the Federalist Party out in presidential elections. Jefferson and other Democratic Republicans are really quick to notice this play and say, basically, this is just a dirty trick that Adams is trying to do. There's no real reason that he's trying to make it harder for immigrants. It's just to make it harder for them to vote for his rival political party, the Democratic Republicans. The second thing here, the Sedition Act, when you see this term sedition, it means speaking out against your government. And so what Adams does is he basically makes it illegal to criticize him, the Federalist Party, with false, scandalous, or malicious statements. Now, that's pretty vague, and the Supreme Court is going to have some issues with the Sedition Act. But before the Supreme Court really steps in here and does anything, we're going to see some opposition to these two laws from the Democratic Republicans. And that's where this question of nullification comes up. If the federal government passes a law that states disagree with, can the states pass a law to violate that federal law? For example, if the federal government, in the case of the Sedition Act here, said that criticizing the federal government or criticizing the Federalists or criticizing the president would be an arrestable offense, could a state like Kentucky or Virginia pass a law protecting people's freedom of speech to do that? And so the question that pops up here is not really terribly answered, but we see the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions responses to the Alien and Sedition Acts. Virginia passes a law, and Kentucky passes a law that protect people from being arrested for this. The two authors of these laws are Jefferson and Madison, two of our most prominent Democratic Republicans. And so you see there the bottom term here, the nullification term, is to declare a law unconstitutional. Now, eventually, that's going to be the job of the Supreme Court. But right now, the Supreme Court doesn't really know what its job is. And so it's up to the states to push back against the federal government. This is going to be a long tradition that goes on to this day in American history, where we see a federal law and we see states that are trying to override that federal law, or at least push back against that federal law. Oftentimes, you're going to see resistance from the states. Sometimes you'll see resistance from the Supreme Court. Sometimes you'll see resistance from Congress. And then it depends on who's enforcing these laws. But sometimes you'll see states passing laws and then a president trying to override that state law. The biggest thing we're going to see with nullification coming up in the next few units is going to be the issue of slavery. And eventually, the nullification that we see is the nullification of federal law and states seceding. And that's where the Civil War starts. So this is going to be a question that pops up here early in the American history, second president, and it's going to continue, and even to this day, where we have things like states passing laws allowing medical and recreational marijuana use. Well, there's federal law against marijuana use, so there's a nullification issue today, even as I record this. This is a picture of Thomas Jefferson on the $2 bill, which if you've never seen a $2 bill before, they do exist. This is not fake money. Thomas Jefferson is on the front, and the $2 bill actually has one of the coolest images on the back. I'll try and pull up an image of that in class, but it's the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and it's a pretty cool image to see on the back. But Jefferson says, if the government creates a law that violates our rights, we have the right to declare that law null and void. And so again, the biggest thing he's talking about here is really the Sedition Act, which is a very blatant attempt to limit free speech. Okay. These are the first examples of nullification in U.S. history, and they set the precedent for further nullification of laws. So, assessment questions. Short and sweet, short and not sweet, I should say, about the Adams presidency. What was the XYZ affair? American diplomats being mistreated by French delegates of their leader Robespierre. Adams doesn't like this. It pushes us to the brink of war between us and France, basically. Number two, does having a president and vice president from different parties help or hinder the government? I kind of gave you guys my opinion on that, but I'll look forward to hearing your responses to that. I think there's definitely pros and cons to both, the way we do it today and the way it was done back then. Number three, how are the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional? So, Alien Act is unconstitutional in that today we would say it violates the 14th Amendment. At the time, it doesn't violate the 14th Amendment, but it makes it harder for immigrants to vote. The Sedition Act is really blatantly unconstitutional because of the First Amendment freedom of speech, okay, freedom of press as well. We're going to look at some examples in class of people that violate these two laws, their punishment, how they respond to it, and the media attention given to Adams' presidency. Number four, how did the 12th Amendment change the way presidents are elected? I kind of addressed this, but to get it more concretely, basically it splits the parties into two tickets. So we would have a Federalist presidential candidate and a Federalist vice presidential candidate, and then a Democratic Republican candidate and a Democratic Republican vice presidential candidate. So it splits the ticket rather than combining the two people who finish first and second and putting them in the White House together. And then the last one here at your tables, create a chart listing the characteristics of Federalists and Republicans, the Democratic Republicans. Who are their leaders? Who do they appeal to? This is really kind of reviewing from 2.1, but I really want to drive home the differences between the two. So make sure you know at least that Federalists tend to be supported in the North. They tend to be pro-Britain. They tend to be pro-industry. And they tend to be pro-federal government. Now, in the case of Adams here, he kind of does a little bit of a tug of war, a little bit too much towards the federal government in the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so there is a point in which pro-federal government is actually going to be pushed back against by Jefferson and Madison, who are your two leaders really at this time for the Democratic Republican Party. Democratic Republicans are appealing to farmers, they're appealing to people in the South, people in the West, and people who are pro-French. So that's kind of the key differences between